So we just finished talking about the various behavioral ways that insects can use to tolerate or deal with environmental conditions that are suboptimal. Now I want to talk a little bit about the various physiological ways, biochemical, cellular ways in which insects can actually deal with unfavorable environments. So when we were talking about behavioral responses, this basically had to do with choices that insects can make based on stimuli that they are receiving about their environment, and changing their orientation to that environment so that they don't suffer the consequences of being in a suboptimal place. Physiological responses have to do with the strategy that basically says, well, we're going to stay here and deal with it. And so what are those ways in which a body can actually deal with these extreme or unfavorable conditions? Well, one kind of hardwired way that insects deal with things like freezing in the winter is to enter a state that's often referred to as diapause. This is not hibernation the same way we think about it with mammals, but it really is a physiological shift in the condition of an individual, so that they enter an altered physiological state that allows them to tolerate with very extreme conditions, things like low temperatures or very dry environments or things like that. This is different than a condition called torpor, which is more temporary and can be reversible. Diapause is something that once it's triggered, there's kind of a physiological response that cannot be backed out of until the right stimuli actually occurred. And this allows them to become tolerant to very extreme environmental conditions. An easy way to illustrate this is to talk about how insects deal with freezing. This is the condition where it gets too cold, and ice is generally bad for cells. When ice forms within cells, ice expands and will basically rupture and burst cells. This is generally not good for your tissues if you have internal failure of the integrity of cells. Almost always leads to death in some way, at least death of the tissue. This is what happens when you get frostbite, for example. Imagine if you have this at the whole body scale. Two ways in which insects generally deal with freezing is to either tolerate low temperature or to avoid freezing altogether. And again, the basic idea is that the formation of ice crystals are bad. Now, what's interesting about water when it reaches its freezing point is that it actually won't form crystals unless there's a nucleating agent, a tiny little piece of something around which the water can actually start forming the structures that we refer to as ice. These could be things like little dust particles, could be proteins, it could be microbes, all kinds of things create these nucleating areas where ice crystals began to form. And so one way in which you can avoid freezing is to actually decrease the temperature at which those ice crystals begin to form in the first place. This is that point at which those ice crystals form is referred to as the supercooling point. And you could do this in a variety of ways. One is to secrete some chemicals within the body that basically drop that supercooling point. These are alcohols, phenols, not unlike what we put in our antifreeze in our cars. Another way in which ice crystals can be avoided is to basically clear the body of any agents that might actually be those nucleating sites. So this involves voiding the guts as temperatures start getting too low as you get into the winter, making sure there's nothing there around which those ice crystals can form. So this is physiologically one way in which this can be avoided. So here's an example of what happens to supercooling points for these lady beetles here. This is the number of ice nuclei that are formed within cells and the temperatures at which those actually start to form. This is on a log scale here. So what the essence of what I want you to see here is that normally You get the formation of ice crystals that start to happen around, negative 15 degrees Celsius. So the supercooling points are already there. And as you increase, as it gets colder here, as you move in this direction here, you get more and more ice crystals forming. However, the presence of certain microbes, like this Pseudomonas here and this other one here that I don't know what it is. This is E. coli is this one here. But the presence of these bacteria here in the guts actually change the supercooling point here, and they make them less tolerant of cold temperatures and more likely to freeze. So this is an example where having those ice nucleating bacteria actually is bad for beetles that would otherwise be pretty tolerant to cold temperatures. Here's another physiological way in which these particular insects deal with low temperatures. This is actually the only endemic insect to Antarctica. It's a little flightless midge in the family Chironomidae. And you can imagine that living in Antarctica, it's going to be cold a lot of the time. Now, even for them, when it gets too cold, survivorship is quite low. But there's this period in here where they can actually tolerate, quite low temperatures, below freezing. But then something starts to happen where they lose the ability to actually do so. The researchers in this study actually found was that these insects have the capacity to protect their tissues from damage when freezing actually happens. But it happens in a way that is dependent on how rapidly they actually freeze. So here's the tissues of the fat body, and here's the tissues of the midgut, and these have been imaged using a fluorescence technique where live tissues show up in green, and red tissues are actually the dead tissues. And what they actually find is if you take these midges and you put them at 9 below zero directly, and the temperature kind of ramps down by itself like this from 2 degrees to 9 below Celsius, you actually get much lower survivorship here than the controls, and you get a lot more tissue damage of both the midgut and the fat body as well. On the other hand, if you take them from 2 degrees to 5 below very rapidly, and then from 5 below to 9 degrees, they call this rapid cold hardening, that survivorship was actually much higher than the ones that were just kind of slowly declining to 9 degrees. What they actually found was that there's a series of genes that are related to heat shock proteins that generate proteins that make them more resistant to the ice damage when they go through this rapid cold hardening compared to the slower chilling here. And that's through the formation of these protective proteins that actually prevent ice crystals from forming. Here's an example of an insect that can thermoregulate under very hot temperatures by spitting up. So here's evaporative cooling is an important way in which you and I actually cool off. That's what we do when we're sweating. We're creating liquid on our bodies that actually evaporates, and this drops our temperature quite rapidly. And there's various species that actually do a very similar things. Grasshoppers will spit up, and they can do this for a short period of time. There's some cicadas that live in the desert that can actually drop their temperature by pooping out a lot of liquids. So they actually feed on xylem. Xylem is the watery part of the vascular fluids that come through a plant. They don't have a lot of nutrients to start with, but by pumping through a lot of it, they can actually drop their temperature significantly below the ambient temperature. And this is a good adaptation for very hot environments. This is an example of a different kind of stress, not temperature stress, but water stress, having to do with water balance. Loss of water for small organisms is really important. Insects, by virtue of being small, have a lot of advantages. We talked about those having to do with the ability to get oxygen to a lot of their tissues using their tracheal system. The flip side of that is that they have a very high surface area to volume ratio. And as a consequence, they have the capacity to lose a lot of moisture through their spiracles and through the integument directly. So many insects, particularly those that live in arid environments, have very thick cuticular tissues that are lined with waxy secretions that basically create kind of a waterproof structure that keeps moisture inside of their body. This cuticle is hydrophobic, and so it actually keeps the water in. And as temperatures get hotter, they actually can change the composition of the cuticular hydrocarbons to actually make them more waxy and less likely to melt at higher temperatures. So this is kind of a put on a thick raincoat and keep your moisture inside sort of a strategy. So here's one that I actually didn't think too much about until I was introduced to the challenge that mosquitoes and other blood-feeding insects actually have. They will take on a huge amount of liquid in the form of a blood meal in a very short period of time. This creates two very intense challenges for the organism. One is that the blood meal is hot, and they actually have the problem of overheating because they've taken on this really hot material into their bodies. It's like you and I drinking a ton of soup, and having a giant belly full, almost the amount of our body weight in our stomachs, full of this really hot material. It's actually possible to overheat. And what mosquitoes do, very analogous to what those cold tolerant midges do, is that they secrete some proteins that actually prevent their bodies from going into what they actually do is they very rapidly secrete a series of proteins here that actually help them tolerate that heat stress that doesn't allow the cells to actually become too damaged in the process. There's also a challenge of having all this liquid, and this liquid may not be osmotically at the same concentrations as the body internal, and that this liquid might not be at the same osmotic concentration for some nutrients, for some solutes as the body of the mosquitoes themselves. And so there's a challenge of not having all of that, all of those goodies that are inside of your body kind of getting sucked into that liquid. As well. So there's other kind of water balance challenges that mosquitoes and other blood-feeding insects actually face, physiological challenges. There are also some really unusual modes of dealing with desiccation, and that is best exemplified by some species that are called extremophiles. So let me give you a couple of examples here. There are some insects that actually live in very low oxygen environments. Many aquatic insects living in the benthos of a stream or a lake may be in areas where there's actually very little oxygen, and insects like other heterotroph need oxygen in order for their physiology to actually work. We're not like plants that need carbon dioxide. We actually need oxygen to fuel our biochemical reactions. And there's some insects that we refer to as bloodworms. These are the larvae of chironomids that actually look red, and the redness actually comes from a series of heme proteins that actually have iron in them, and these are used for basically maintaining or capturing oxygen at these very low concentrations, and these have very high concentrations of hemoglobin basically in their hemolymph. That's what gives them those red colors. So anyway, so this kind of wraps up some of the basics of how insects deal with these highly heterogeneous, invariable, abiotic environments, temperature, humidity, oxygen, and so on, and some of the adaptations that they have to actually deal with those.